Welcome everyone. On behalf of Ginger Wright and Tom Ulrich, the co-leads for this particular exercise. Very excited to have folks here today. Many of you have been here for our past webinars, which were sort of informative. They were designed to convey information, to educate. Now's the time that we're actually rolling up our sleeves and getting the work done. We're going to have just a little bit of discussion today about why we're here. Tom's going to talk a little bit about some of the use cases. We're going to review some of the potential roles in a proof of concept, highlighting what's happened in the past. But then really a core aspect is going to be to sort of talk about what our goals are here. This is where we're hoping that you'll be able to chime in and say, what does good look like? And then after that planning discussion, we will get into the logistics for how we're going to work on this moving forward. And we'll be taking advantage of Idaho National Lab's power there. So we'll start off with a very brief discussion of, hey, why are we here? So if we go to the next slide, and there's a request to thank you. So why are we here? Couple of key approaches. So first, SBOM is important. Next slide. And so hopefully by now you have some idea of what software bill of materials is. The thing that we want to make clear is that this is coming. This idea has been out in the world. There's growing enthusiasm and attention to it. More people are providing them, have the capability to provide them. More people are thinking about how to consume them. And it's coming for everyone. This isn't going to belong to just one sector. We're seeing healthcare, automotive, finance, government, defense. We're seeing this in a lot of places, and that includes you. That this is going to be affecting everyone. And going to the next slide, we need to understand this as the energy community. What is unique for our world that perhaps isn't quite considered in some of the other use cases? And that involves two things. One, we need to learn about the state of play. We're going to take in the knowledge that the other areas in the broader software world has learned about SBOM over the past 2 or 3 years, longer. So it's, again, not a new idea. And then the other core aspect, why are we doing a proof of concept, is because we need to learn by doing. We need to understand we have these ideas, we have these papers, but we need to actually show what happens when this meets not just the technology in our world, but also our organizations, our businesses, and things like that. So first, let's be very clear, though, about what this isn't. And on the next slide, so first, quick caveat, this is not a regulatory process. NTIA has sort of been the primary convener around SBOM. We're not a regulator. We're working very closely with the Department of Energy, our partner here, and not just INL, but the other national labs. And none of them have a regulatory authority. And so what we're really trying to do is help the community help itself. The other thing I want to be very clear about is that this is not a business development opportunity. We are very excited that there are a lot of companies that are interested in this, not just on the manufacturer and on the asset owner side of things. We're going to talk about that. SBOM will only work if we have a rich ecosystem around this. But this is not the time or the place to talk about one's products, to solicit business, to solicit testimonials or things like that. NTIA has worked very hard around that. Department of Energy has even stricter rules about that. They cannot be associated with anything that is built around the competitive marketplace. And so I'm going to ask nicely that everyone sort of respect that space, that this is a space for sharing ideas, not talking about businesses. And the other thing I'll say is if you think that someone is doing that, or you have a concern, or even any questions about whether something crosses the line, please reach out to me, to Ginger, and to Tom, and we can talk about this. We want this to be an open and collegial space, but a big part of that is making sure that we're just focusing on the ideas, not trying to do business development or marketing. So feel free to follow up if you have any questions around that. We're here. We want to make sure that everyone can have a positive experience. And lastly, that leads to the fact on the next slide that this is your process. So please ask questions, share ideas. The chat is going to be here, but ultimately, this isn't about us talking into cameras. This is about you sharing ideas and beginning to think about what this exercise can look like. So I'll pause for a second. And I think as we go through this agenda, we'll have Tom and Ginger introduce themselves as sort of the co-leads of this process. So I think next we go to the use cases.
Okay. Good. All right. Yeah, thanks, Alan. My name's Tom Ulrich, and I'm a consultant to the electric power industry on cybersecurity, specifically supply chain security, and other things like NERC-CIP. And I also write a blog that gets a lot of attention. And I've been working with the NTIA initiative for about 6 months now, or more than that, not more than that. And so I'm very excited to be, helping to make this proof of concept a reality, because it's, it's really needed, and it's going to be great for the energy industry. So in terms of use cases, there are both supplier and consumer use cases for SBOMs. The supplier probably already has a pretty good idea of what SBOMs, of why they're used, why they're needed. In fact, most suppliers probably already have them, but they're not distributing them now. Consumers' use cases I divide into procuring software and operating software. Note that these use cases apply both to integrated devices that contain software and standalone software that you load on Intel standard hardware. And I want to focus on the vulnerability management use cases, although we could discuss cases like licensing and feature workshops, but to be honest, vulnerability management, if you look at things that appear in the press, etc., they're all about that. And this really is probably the most important use case, at least right now. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, thanks. Procurement use cases. If you get an SBOM from a supplier whose product you're considering for purchase, you can potentially, and of course this depends on the level of information that's provided in the SBOM. One is that you can identify unpatched component vulnerabilities and then negotiate with the supplier about patching them. That's very important. The second is you can identify out-of-date or end-of-life components and negotiate a timetable for updating or replacing them. This is especially important because if a component is out of life, that means there aren't going to be any more patches for it. So the next heartbleed comes along, and if that component is vulnerable to it, there's the supplier's product is going to be stuck with this component on it, with this big vulnerability. So that's something, if they really do have end-of-life components in their software, you need to ask the supplier, well, when are you going to replace this? It doesn't have to be tomorrow, but they need to have a plan for replacing it, either with a new component or an upgrade to the one that was there, or perhaps just writing the code themselves, but they need to do something about it. The third important use case is you can judge the supplier. For one thing, did they provide an SBOM in the first place? Right now, the answer is no, they didn't, because I don't think anybody's doing that. But the important thing is, if you have one supplier who has provided an SBOM to you, and one supplier who, a competitor that you're considering who doesn't, it's, that's got to count for something. It's certainly not going to make you choose one supplier or the other, but you need to consider all these things. Another thing you need to consider is whether there are unpatched component vulnerabilities, or more importantly, how many of them there are. If there's one supplier with 20 unpatched component vulnerabilities, another one with one, well, that's a pretty good mark about the the latter supplier as being perhaps a, more someone who's much more on top of this problem. I might point out that, the average software product has over 100 components in it, and some products have thousands of components. So if you think of each of those can have vulnerabilities, you begin to see the magnitude of this problem. And SBOMs are the only way you can really make good judgments when you're procuring software. About vulnerabilities, is because they open up a whole window of vulnerabilities that just isn't available to you if you don't have the SBOM. Are many components getting old? They may not be actually out of support, but they may very well be, if they're 3 years old, 4 years old, they probably were not developed with the same practices that the suppliers use today, and they may be more of a security risk. And so, again, a supplier with old components sitting on their inside their software should be asked, well, what are you going to do about those? Are you going to upgrade them, or are you going to replace them? But they need to do something about that. And another is just, is there a lot the supplier doesn't know about the components? If they have components that they don't even know where they came from, that's a big red flag right there. Next slide, please. Operating use cases. If you receive SBOMs for software you operate, you can potentially, one is identify new vulnerabilities in components and ask when the supplier will patch or otherwise mitigate them. This is probably the use case most people think of. However, I have that asterisk there because it's a very important consideration. A large percentage of vulnerabilities in components aren't exploitable in the product itself. That is, there can be various reasons for this. A very easy to understand reason is that the component consists of a library with 5 modules. The supplier only needed one of those modules, so that's the only one they incorporate in their product. The vulnerability is actually in one of the other modules. But the problem is, you will go to the NVD, you'll look up that component name, and you'll see, aha, it has vulnerability X. And then the idea is you're going to call up the supplier and say, hey, when are you going to fix this vulnerability in your product? And they'll patiently explain to you for the 1,000th time that month, and because they've probably explained it to a lot of other people, well, that vulnerability is not actually exploitable in our product. In this case, because we didn't even include the particular module in that library. So the point is, this saves you a lot of time going and trying to find vulnerabilities that, scan for them when they're not there. And it saves the supplier a lot of time. In fact, one supplier estimated it would save them about 2,000 calls a month to not have people calling up about vulnerabilities which are just purely false positives. However, they do have, the idea is they will issue a document called a VEX, stands for Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. This is a format that the NTIA is working on now. And, when I say the NTIA, it can be you. There's no, everybody is welcome to join in on this. And it will essentially say to the users, it will be distributed by the supplier to the same organizations and people that got the SBOM in the first place. It will say, yes, component A is included in our product, as the SBOM said, and yes, component A has a vulnerability if you look in the National Vulnerability Database. However, in our product, that vulnerability is not exploitable, and here's the reason why. And so this is a big deal, and we are, but it's fortunately a problem that's definitely being solved. So another use case is when new vulnerabilities are identified. For example, Ripple 20, you can determine whether they're found in any software you operate. Now, when I say any, that's contingent, of course, on having an SBOM for every piece of software on your network. I doubt that will ever be the case. I don't think there's ever going to be 100% coverage for SBOMs, but maybe in a year you'll have just 5, 5 out of 100, or maybe 10. You shouldn't be discouraged by that, because even 5 is great. At least for those 5, you don't have to go hunting around and scanning on them to see whether they have this, have Ripple 20 or not. You'll be able to tell from the SBOM whether they do. And it's just, it saves you a lot of time. So another use case is you can independently mitigate a vulnerability if a patch is delayed. So, suppliers don't always, even if a patch really is exploitable, I mean, a vulnerability really is exploitable in their product, they won't always fix it right away for some reason. Or they may tell you, you know what, we don't think this is very important and it's going to be hard to patch, and so we're just not going to do it. I mean, that's a legitimate response. They can't do everything. But if you disagree with them and you think it is important, then you need to take some mitigation on your own. The point is, you would never even know about this. In fact, you wouldn't know about any of the items on this in this whole slide deck if you didn't have a vulnerability. I mean, if you didn't have an SBOM. That's really the key to all these things. That's why it's called the Software Transparency Initiative, because it really makes your software much more transparent. You can also learn about end-of-life or out-of-date components, which we discussed in the previous slide. And finally, you can make risk-informed decisions to prioritize your response to vulnerabilities. So if you have 2 important vulnerabilities that you want to mitigate, and one, because you have SBOMs, is found in 20 products in your environment, whereas another one isn't found at all. No, is only found in 1 product. I would, if I were you, I would go ahead and mitigate the one with 20 that's in 20 products, because obviously that poses a much bigger risk, and then do the other one. But again, you can't make a decision like that without an SBOM. So this has not been a complete discussion of use cases. Next slide, please. For a more complete, a really very well-written document, I recommend you go to the document called Roles and Benefits for SBOM Across the Supply Chain, available at the URL shown. And thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate that. Super helpful. And we're going to turn things over to Ginger in just a moment, but I want to take a few minutes, and I'll try to be very brief, to review how people have thought about this idea of a proof of concept to start with. And this can serve as sort of a straw man. Again, all I'm sort of laying out is some of the basics. And as you think about this, think about how you can adapt this to your needs. So the basic model of a proof of concept for an SBOM, for SBOMs, is to say, hey, rather than just talking about it and writing guidance, let's actually try to do it. And the way of understanding SBOMs, as Tom really did a good job of highlighting, is in a supply chain, right? We have people who make things, and we have people who use things with software. And so let's help the producers who make the software and the consumers share SBOMs with the consumers of software. And so we have a data exchange. So with mutual consent, right? Everyone has planned things together. Next slide, please. And the producers are working on, hey, what do we need to learn as a community about how we're generating SBOMs, right? What are the challenges? What's new for us? What can we learn that's already been done? And then, of course, the consumers are really expanding on what Tom just talked about, which is what are the use cases for SBOM consumption? Because we don't just want to say, hey, we have the SBOMs, let's put them on the shelf over here and admire them on weekends. The goal really is to say, how do we use this? How do we integrate this into our existing thinking about security and software risk? So the important thing is that we have a stakeholder community that's working to understand all of this, right? Everyone can participate in this SBOM proof of concept. Next slide, please. So, however, because we sort of want to make sure that the data that's being shared is done in a safe, comfortable fashion, we have some sort of data protection for members of that data exchange, right? So that the manufacturers that are generating the SBOMs and the consumers that are using it know that this data isn't necessarily going to be public, and it's not going to be used for things other than this exercise. In the past, the healthcare world that you guys have heard us talk a lot about has used an NDA, and we'll share that NDA so you can get a sense of what that looks like. And it basically just says you can't use it for anything. It's been tested. You can't use this data for any other purpose. You can't share it. And it's been reviewed by some pretty serious lawyers already, right? These are big manufacturers in the medical space, and it made it through their general counsel. So the members of this exchange is a smaller subgroup, right? It's the we'll talk about who that might be, but essentially it's the producers of the SBOM and the consumers of the SBOM. But everyone can weigh in on the details of this. How do we generate SBOMs and how do we use them? That part happens in sort of this public working group model. And then we have this exchange, members of exchange, which is protected legally so that folks feel comfortable. There are other mechanisms we can use. The Citrix world that Idaho National Labs has been part of is one form of exchange. The automotive sector is using their protections under the Auto ISAC. There are other tools out there if an NDA isn't the right one for you, but the model that we're talking about generally says, hey, all of us can weigh in on how to do this, even manufacturers or consumers that aren't quite ready to sort of roll up their sleeves and do this, they can still weigh in on how this is going to happen. Now, of course, we talked earlier about a very rich ecosystem for SBOMs, including third-party support. So on the next slide, we talk about what that looks like, because of course, there are some third parties that specialize in helping to create SBOMs. There are some third parties that specialize in how do we consume SBOMs, right? We're using them for risk analysis. We're using them as part of our vulnerability management or our SIEM model or our data management model. And of course, there are third-party services already out there today that are thinking about how do we enhance the SBOM data, how do we supplement that SBOM data. We want to take advantage of those. But again, we're really trying to anchor on the production and consumption side. And so one way to think about this, and again, it's going to be up to you as a community, but one way that we recommend thinking about this is to say, right, it's the, I call it the vampire model, where someone has to be invited in to cross the threshold. So anyone that already has some kind of relationship, this is good because they already have some trust and they're already touching the data as well. But that's something that we as a community can talk about. What we want to make clear is the emphasis here on the producer and consumer side of things. Now, last note here on the next slide, when I say producer and consumer, what do we mean? Well, the past models have assumed two groups. So we have the manufacturer in this case and the asset owner side of things. So in this case, right, we've got our big energy manufacturers, and then the utilities would be the asset owners. But there are other ways that we can think about it, and I just want to throw these up there to see to sort of inspire your brainstorming. So just we do one slide further. So it could be the manufacturer, the system integrator. It could be the manufacturer and the manufacturer's risk assessment organization. We can also may really want to think about upstream suppliers and saying, well, it's not just the manufacturer, but it's the ingredients for those. And so do we want to do a three-part approach? Do we want to do two-part approaches? There are many ways that we can explore. I encourage you to think about, as you brainstorm this, think broadly. And then as we start moving forward, we can start simple and then make it more effective. So, we want to make sure that we're still making progress here and successfully brainstorming what this can look like. Now, to actually start rolling up our sleeves and getting work done, I think we've been talking for a while. Ginger, do you want to sort of move us in that direction? And as a reminder, introduce yourself to the community.
Absolutely, Alan. And I'm Ginger Wright. I am a program manager at the Idaho National Lab, and I lead INL's participation in the Citrix program, which is DOE's program for testing critical infrastructure components We, as part of our testing process, have been generating SBOMs and HBOMs and have learned a lot about the process and about the potential for exchange in so doing. So we are very interested in participating with others who are interested in being part of the ecosystem. I wanted to start by asking you all. We've talked a lot so far today. We've taken up about half of our time, and I'd really like to turn the direction of the conversation the other way. But so that we don't have conflict over microphones, I'm going to ask you to talk, starting in the chat, about what could good look like with this proof of concept. We are all here because, like the boy and girl I depict in this slide, we think sharing is a good idea, and we'd either like to provide something or consume something as a part of sharing. Past proof of concepts have focused on generation and publication of SBOMs for actual devices in use, things that were prioritized by the community of interest. Consumption of the SBOMs across specific use cases that were focused on acquisition and management. So that's a nice way of not only producing the SBOM, but leveraging it for risk management activities. Evaluation of a variety of SBOM formats and collaborative efforts to use SBOM to secure the device ecosystem. And there's been some conversation about that already in the chat. So my first question for you today is, what else would you like to see? These seem like really good goals in general, but are there other specific goals that we should focus on? I did see Brian Owen ask about the potential to use SBOM for verification of software integrity and authenticity. And Brian, I was going to see if Katie could help us pass the mic to you, and if you could take just a minute and describe what that means to you. What are you thinking there?
Brian, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
I got it. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Ginger, for seeing that comment in the chat. The idea is that is there some way that SBOMs could feed a authoritative list of known software? I know hashes are part of the SBOM format, so it seemed like this could be a way that could be shared instead of every asset owner having to reinvent the wheel there.
Okay, and so it sounds like exploring ways of doing that effectively and efficiency, and not inviting the 1,000 calls a month that Tom talked about in his use case conversation would be an effective thing for us to do.
I think so. I know I've heard some people in the energy sector have systems. Maybe this is a solved problem for everyone, but my guess is that a lot of people are having to do this themselves. So.
Okay, I'm also seeing some interest in the chat of exploring sources of components, where the countries of origin are, exploration of secure distribution methods, especially for encryption of encrypted software, where the risk of disclosure could create risk for an entire customer base. And then I'm seeing notes about demonstrating SIP 10-3 software verification capabilities. So those are good. As we all think about, at the end of this conversation, there will be an ask. And so I'm just going to clue everybody in. We are hoping to find a number of people who would like to produce SBOMs, and a number of people who would like to consume SBOMs. Ideally, we will find ways that we can leverage within that legal circle of protection that Alan showed on his slides. So even if there was an asset owner who wanted to explore what it was like in their organization to receive an SBOM and whether they were ready to consume it, to digest it, and then explore what kind of questions came up. That is something that we could explore as part of our proof of concept using simulated data. So although it's exciting to have a real SBOM from a real vendor, we will learn a lot exploring simulated SBOMs potentially before we explore on real ones. So if that's of interest, please indicate in the chat and we can find a way to work through that. I talked with Alan and Tom about the potential for some worksheets to let us work through particular aspects of the problem and kind of get our muscles ready, get built up. If there are manufacturers that would like to produce an SBOM and transmit it to another part of their organization, again, presumably within that legal circle of protection, so that maybe the product organization can produce an SBOM and determine if a PCERT can ingest it and make good decisions and recommendations from it, and again, explore what their questions are. That could be within the circle of goodness for this proof of concept. So I would invite you, as we think about some more open options, please put in the chat things that you would like to explore. Ideally, we would have some parties that are protected within that NDA who come back to the larger proof of concept community, and instead of telling us all of the gory details that the NDA protects, they can tell us what they've learned and how the experience worked, and where we as a community may need to build up additional resources to enable success. So I'm seeing the chat slow down. As you all are thinking about it, the next question I had for you are whether there are any specific barriers to entry. Are there any things that we as the coordinators of this proof of concept need to find answers to that would enable your participation? I think Alan and Tom mentioned an NDA, a sample NDA. We are certainly in no way prescribing that NDA, that format, or that language. We have all met attorneys here and we don't envy their jobs. But it is a starter position that if you are interested in the potential for sharing protected information with another party, we can offer that NDA to make the homework a little bit shorter. Are there other tools like that that we can provide that will help you move forward? And again, I would welcome your comments in the chat.
So one thing that's, I think, been useful as folks are starting to think about this in previous proof of concepts is for folks to sort of say, hey, we think we know what it's like to generate an SBOM, but actually generating them from a company's own software has been a learning experience. And so on the manufacturer side in particular, learning what some of the obstacles are has been helpful. And that's, in particular in the healthcare world, where they've been doing, devices and sort of understanding that process is quite useful.
Alan, I see a question in the chat from Stephen Trakian about whether there is a preferred format. Could you talk a little bit about what the past proof of concepts have done as far as the formats of the SBOMs they've exchanged?
Sure. So, and thanks, Stephen. It's a good question. The broader SBOM process has identified 3 data standards that can be used to convey SBOM data. And our approach has been to say, let's not pick a winner in a standards discussion. Let's emphasize interoperability. So these 3 standards are SPDX, CycloneDX, and SWID. And there's some information that we can share and point to this. I think what might be one of the best paths forward is for the community to remain quite agnostic about that, but to maybe start with one. And we can sort of work through and bring in some folks who have expertise in these. I know that there's some folks that have been playing with these different standards that have been part of this, that are part of the chat. So I think as we move forward, we can say, hey, where do we want to start? But that's probably not the best starting point, right? It's sort of, I'd encourage the community to say, let's talk about what the structure of sharing is going to be, and then slowly we'll drill down on the technical side when we can bring in experts, and of course, many of you have the expertise yourselves. Is that helpful?
It was to me. And it looks like for those in the chat, there is wide agreement. In our brainstorming, we also thought about some additional opportunities, and we're talking about some of those now, but I wanted to put these as ticklers out so that it's not only producing and consuming software bills of materials that this pilot could do. One of our goals is certainly to explore education and exploration. What sort of, we've spent several meetings together talking about SBOM and exploring some broad topics, but are there specifics? Tom mentioned the VEX process that's under development, where we can understand how to communicate about the reachability of subcomponent vulnerabilities within a code set. We've talked about formats, and I know in our own testing process with Citrix, we've explored that the information that Citrix needs to collect and produce for a software bill of materials that describes the characteristics we're interested in is not completely overlapped with that set of information that a full SBOM includes. And so is there room for a partial SBOM or one with odd perturbances, odd bits of information that are for a particular use case? And so that might be an interesting item for exploration. We've talked about the exchange of simulated non-sensitive SBOMs, exploration of additional use cases. We've talked about some alternate producers and consumers, whether it is an upstream supplier who produces an SBOM and provides it to a manufacturer, or a manufacturer within their own organization, a consumer, an asset owner within their own organization. Are there some other roles that we should think about who might play a part in our proof of concept? One of the important things for us is issue spotting and mitigation. Certainly, NDAs are an easy first issue that we can start to work on. But as you all start to think about things, and complexity has been something that has been discussed, just the sheer overwhelming magnitude of how complex it is to put together a software bill of materials with all of the trimmings and get all of the pieces detailed, that's going to take a lot of work for us to pull together. So where there are some issues, again, that we can start to mitigate, please identify those, and we'll start to pull together, whether it is follow-on meetings, we'll focus on varieties of those topics, or we'll bring together tools that you can leverage that will help mitigate those issues for you. Also, if you have ideas for things that we may not have talked about that you'd like to explore in this proof of concept, if you will put it in the chat, that will be the fodder for ideas for future meetings like this. So I'm just going to give a second. If anybody has been thinking about things, put them in now. I see a comment about legacy product challenges, and that's something that we certainly experience, where the software manufacturer may not even be in business anymore, but the product is still in use. And how do we generate the information we need to do risk management for that product? So that might be an interesting exploration topic. And while that chat moves forward, if you are interested in being an SBOM producer or consumer within our community, I'd ask that you send an email to sbomenergypoc@inl.gov. And I promise that is not a secret cabal, but that is an efficient way to get an email to Alan, Tom, and me, so that we all read it at one time. And I will also put that email address in the chat, just not in the 30-point font that I just tried to paste it in. So that will be coming to you. Please send us an email and let us know about your interest, and we will start getting the documentation to you, and again, begin working with you to answer any questions that you have. And Tom Allen, as I struggle with the font sizes, did you have anything you wanted to add here?
There are a couple of fun points here just on the, and this might be useful for, see if the community has some decisions. They've started to talk about the relative merits of starting with legacy, which of course is going to be very important, versus new or more products that are currently under active development. Curious whether folks have an opinion on which one to start with, and if there's a suggestion for how to approach this, because again, we at NTI we have a mantra of crawl, then walk, then run. Now that's a little time intensive, but especially as we try to get this underway, I think laying out where we want to focus our efforts. We could say, let's start with the new stuff because we have the software and we can integrate it into build tools, and it's on the other hand, we could say, hey, listen, from a risk prioritization, as Tom just chimed in on the chat, let's focus on that. And I think that's going to be something that we as a community are going to want to talk about. I think we're going to want to eventually address both, but trying to do both of them at the same time might be tricky. There was a couple of references in the chat to sort of integrity, both Brian's point and Dick's point, and I think that's going to be an important piece as well. That's something that again is on the vanguard of what the community is working on. So that will be has the benefit of being very, very important, and it has the drawback of being something that isn't completely settled engineering. There are a number of ways out there to deploy it. And so as we think through it, could be very useful, but at the same time, will be a little extra work to focus on. And again, that's going to be the tension as you come up with ideas of what else you'd like to work on.
So as you all think about those large questions, I have some small questions for you. It is the time in the meeting where we think about logistics. So I wanted to first ask about frequency of meetings. I would propose an every other week cadence for us. That gives us a week on where we'll have a joint meeting like this and a week off where we may have time to interact with each other individually. And so I'd love in the chat, whether it's thumbs up or other indicators, does that every other week seem like a reasonable cadence? And I will let that go in the chat. I did see a question about whether there is a target date for the POC. I believe that we have a start date, which is today, and then a regular meeting cadence, but I don't think we've defined a particular end date. I think we can get towards that as we get a little more clear on how much scope this group wants to explore together. It could be that we're able to define some goals that we can work out fairly quickly, or it could be that we define a set of things that we'd like to spend a little bit longer exploring. So I'm seeing generally support for the every other week cadence. The second topic that we brainstormed about was protection of conversations. Thus far, this has been a very open engagement. We have recorded and posted the recordings and the proceedings on the internet, along with the slides that we have presented. I can see in the future that we may wander into some technical conversations where a bit more protection is desired. And there are some best practices for kind of by agreement protection, including Chatham House or traffic light protocol. Alan made a wonderful note in our pre-conversations that Chatham House doesn't work very well when the conversation is being recorded, because any privacy made by obscuring the identity is quickly remedied by sitting through the recording and then observing who made the comment. And that was one reason we wanted to leverage the chat today, so that we didn't expose you to the problem before we had talked to you about your recommendations. So if there are preferences in the chat, please express those. again, we can stay open like we are now, continue to record, continue to put the whole proceedings of what we do together out for everyone, or we could start to limit the audience. And I have no preference, but I would ask those who do to please make their wishes known. Thirdly, right now, Alan has developed a mailing list that includes a great many interested parties. And so we wanted to ask about creating a mailing list just for those who had identified that they wanted to be part of the proof of concept, so that you all had a fast way to email each other as the work went on together. So we have not constructed that mailing list yet, but we are looking at doing so. And again, if in the chat, if you have any preferences, please let us know and we'll see what we can do to put that together. Finally, I wanted to talk about meeting summaries. We have a representative on the call who's taking notes. So in addition to the recording of this meeting, we will put summary information out. And currently that's on the NTIA website, although we are looking to get a website that's specific for this proof of concept where we can link out to many of the NTIA resources, but feature and focus on the things that are for this proof of concept. So those were the logistical notes that I had. Tom, Alan, is there anything else that we should cover before we open it up to further comments and questions?
I want to pick up on what David has started in the chat, but because I think that's quite similar to the general POC model, but I think you've sketched out the importance of getting some logistics as well.
Yeah, I'm good with what we've done so far.
Okay,
So
go ahead.
I was going to say, should we? David sort of had an idea of what some sharing could look like. Should we give him a moment? We'll put him on the spot, and I can make him give him the floor.
That would be great. David, the floor is headed to you.
I just need to figure out how to do this. Ginger, sorry, excuse me. Catherine, I may need your help for this.
David, you should be able to unmute.
I think I'm live now.
Great, thank you.
Am I on? Yes.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Pretty simple concept. I was sitting here chatting with some of the guys in our supply chain and asking the question, what do they know about SBOM? Have they ever asked one for a vendor to provide one? And if so, what was the format? And then how would we review it? How smart do we have to be to understand what's in it? And do we end up with tools that end up scanning it and going, oh, that one's a problem? So I just, from an asset owner point of view, I think if we put some pressure on, that could be very helpful to make this happen. Not that I want to really pressure anybody or anything like that, but I think we're ultimately the ones that are really holding this problem in the end, right? Or we are. Yeah.
And I think one of the approaches behind this POC model is to give you a safe space to have that conversation both with your peer asset owners, so you can talk with each other, as well as giving your suppliers some what we'll call a shallow end to sort of get feet wet and say, we're going to do it with certain types of products that we're ready for it or not. And you can emphasize, hey, we want these types of products, those types of products. That's the goal behind this POC model, is to help folks, learn together. And hopefully that would be both gentler but faster. Do you have any thoughts on sort of that approach?
No, that sounds great. We just need to make sure that from our side here that the right people are at the meeting and are involved.
And so to that point, and this also applies to everyone in the chat, how do you guys think about who should be this? Because of course, some of you work for small agile companies where it's, everyone can do everything. Some of you work for giant companies where you have a large community. Are there particular roles where you think these should be at the table, or where we need to bring people in?
Well, I'll continue just for a minute. Working for a very large company, I would say that we need to make sure that there should be a technical person and also a supply chain person in that meeting. But it needs to be the right ones that are involved in the processes of making this a reality. And so we need to do a little bit of probing inside of this large company to figure out exactly who should be there. It takes some energy. So we'll do that. Thanks.
Excellent. For the and this is also for the chat, are there resources that we might be able to pull together to help any of you out there do this? And again, this also applies to manufacturers as well as asset owners. There's a good point in the chat on smaller organizations. One of the preeminent problems in cybersecurity, in fact, right after this one, I'm going to go speak on a thing about the comm sector. Small organizations, always at risk, and the challenge is to sort of figure out, especially as we're getting our feet wet, we don't want to overwhelm small organizations that don't have the resources. Ginger, are there other things that will help us sort of sketch things out?
I think, so I'm planning on one of our future meetings to have an interface where we can explore these ideas and everyone can take the cursor and go write and draw and type and create their own sticky notes and do dot voting and some of those wonderful facilitation exercises that you're also familiar with. So that is coming. But I'm seeing interest in use cases that are around vulnerability management. I'm curious if there are also there's also an accompanying interest in use cases that are surrounding asset management and maybe procurement. So starting with those may be a good first step. What I've heard today, and I'm going to summarize, make sure that I've caught everything, is that an every other week meeting cadence is the right answer. It appears that there is openness to a mailing list and no specific preferences at this point, so we can work that out. I have not heard any preferences about protection of conversations. So with that, I'll plan our next meeting as continuing in an open format like this one. I'll send out meeting summary information from this meeting to the mailing list, and I'm hoping that will spur ideas. So if you would like to either email in response to those meeting summaries, or again, I've put that SBOM Energy POC at inl.gov, and that will quickly get to Alan, Tom, and I with your ideas and thoughts. By the end of the week, we'll have the meeting summary for you and also the beginning of an agenda for our next meeting. So if you have ideas or recommendations for that agenda, please let us know. So Alan, would you like to bring us home?
Thank you. No, really appreciate that, Ginger. And we know that this is, we're now sort of in a pretty wide open space. And that's a little challenging, right? We've given you a very hard task, which is here's a blank sheet of paper. We're going to work hard to take some of your ideas that you just gave us, as Ginger said, and try to give you some starting points. If for no other reason, we'll put some, people always like to tell other people that their ideas are wrong. So we'll try to get some ideas that you can just tell us we're wrong rather than telling each other that we're wrong. And we can start the ball rolling. So we're very excited that so many of you took the time and showed up. And then the last thing I'll say is please reach out to us. We have resources available to start to explain the general idea of SBOM including ntia.gov/SBOM. But there are a lot more resources out there, including some other videos where we have had more experts from INL and from different communities who sort of explain this. So we're going to try to make resources available. If you need more from us, please ask. That's what we're here for. Okay. Well, thank you all again for taking the time. We're going to work hard to be clear communicators, and we're excited to launch this. We think this actually is a pretty revolutionary step to think about security. We're coming at the tail end of National Supply Chain Security Awareness Month, and so we're happy to join that celebration and look forward to continuing to work with you all moving forward. Thank you to Tom and Ginger for stepping up and helping herd the cats. But again, this is yours. We're just here to facilitate.